Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar called Feeding Communities in the Face of Adversity, Municipal Emergency Planning and Policy Options for Healthy Food Access. We're super excited to have so many people joining us today. I can tell it's a very hot topic of the moment, so we're excited to have you all. My name is Lavani Nelson, and I'm the Associate Director at Vermont Law School's Center for Agriculture and Food Systems, which I'll refer to as CAPS, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. All right, next slide, please. All right, so here's an overview of what we're going to be talking about, starting with a brief introduction to the Healthy Food Policy Project. We're then going to hear from Luis Nieves-Ruiz, who is the East Central Florida Regional Planning Council's Economic Development Manager, and he's going to talk about comprehensive plans and other planning tools to prepare for food access disruptions. After that, we're going to hear from Amanda Carls, who's staff attorney at Public Health Law Center. She's going to talk about some specific policies that we've identified over the past couple months that provide access to healthy food during emergencies. And lastly, we're going to have Ross Daniels, who is a community planner also at the Public Health Law Center, talk about future implications of these policies. In terms of the scope of this webinar, I just want to say a few things up front. We're going to be talking about local policies and planning strategies that are specific to the US, but we do think that a lot of what we're talking about will be relevant to people who are outside of our country, given that we do have people joining us today from around the world. Another thing that I just want to mention is that we've received a lot of really important questions in the pre-webinar survey. Thank you for submitting those. And some of them we will address during the webinar, but some are just outside of the scope of this presentation. For example, one person asked, how can we assure that lived experience of all communities, vulnerable and less so, is used to inform emergency response and recovery? And I just want to say that we think this is a super important question. We will not be going super deep into that today, but our partners at UConn Rudd Center for Food Policy and Obesity will be hosting a webinar on authentic community engagement and policy co-development process over the summer that will be able to address that question. So stay tuned. We'll be probably promoting it around the same channels that we promoted this webinar. All right, next slide. So the Healthy Food Policy Project is funded by the USDA National Ag Library, and the goal of our projects is to identify and elevate local laws that support access to healthy food, contribute to strong local economies, improved environmental conditions, health equity, and focus on socially disadvantaged and marginalized groups. The three partner organizations that have worked collaboratively on the project are CAFS, where I'm based, Public Health Law Center, where Amanda and Ross, who you'll hear later, are based, and then UConn Rudd Center for Food Policy and Obesity. And here at the Center for Ag and Food Systems, where I work, we train law and policy students to develop real-world solutions for a more sustainable and just food system. And we're also a center that does research and advocacy. And I'm not gonna have time to talk about what all the other centers do, but I encourage you to check out all of our organization's websites if you wanna learn more about what we do. Next slide, please. All right, so we found that it's helpful to understand exactly what we mean when we say different words like healthy food. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of the webinar, I'm gonna provide some basic definitions that our project team came up with, working with our advisory committee for the purpose of this project, but feel free to use these widely as they might fit your needs. By healthy food, we mean food that is minimally processed, fresh, frozen, or canned produce that has little, if any, sugar, salt, or fat. Food that's culturally relevant, food that meets evidence-based nutrition standards, food that is both nutritious and safe to eat. Next slide. And when we say access, we're talking about food being accessible when it's affordable, when community members can readily grow, raise it, find it, obtain it, transport it, prepare it, or eat it. So that's a lot. And the next slide, please. And by health equity, we mean, and this is a kind of big definition, the absence of disadvantage in chronic disease-related health outcomes, regardless of one's race or ethnicity, religion, socioeconomic status, gender, age, mental health, cognitive, sensory, or physical disability, sexual orientation, or gender identity, and or geographic location. And again, these were very useful for us in doing our project work. So we have more definitions. You can find them on our website. All right, yes, next slide. So the Healthy Food Policy Project website is built around these three components that you can see here. There's a policy database, a food systems crosswalk. And we also have case studies that highlight the importance of the community engagement process in policy development. And we also have resources that aren't here on this screenshot. One that might be useful is about drafting definitions for food access policies. And another one recently launched is zoning for urban ag. Next slide. You got it, Russ. All right, so due to COVID-19, like a lot of organizations and projects, we've shifted our scope a little bit to focus right now on policies that support food access during this pandemic and can be used for other emergencies down the road. So Amanda's going to talk a lot about this new resource that's on our website. I just wanted to let you all know this is our latest and greatest addition. All right, so now we're going to do a really quick poll to see who we have in the audience today. So Stephanie's going to send that out to folks. So just take a minute and answer the poll. All right, so hopefully people have gotten a chance to answer those two very quick and simple questions. And Stephanie is going to show us the results so that everybody can get a sense of who we have with us today. All right, looks like we have a very broad range, you know, a lot of different people from different sectors. And some people have been using planning and policy tools in their community, but some have not. So hopefully today you can learn more about what this might look like and how it might help you in your work in your communities. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our first speaker, Louise.
Thank you, Lilani. Again, my name is Luis Nieves Ruiz, and I currently serve as the Economic Development Manager for the East Central Florida Regional Planning Council. We're a council of governments located in Orlando, Florida. Notwithstanding my current title at the council, I still consider myself an urban planner. I'm a planner by heart. I also have been involved in some form of like food systems research for about 10 years. So based on this experience, I actually seen what are kind of the areas where both fields are going to kind of intertwine. There are many tasks that planners are responsible for that do have an effect on food system planning. First and foremost being the actual creation of development and standards and land use policies that affect the activities, the location of activities that have to do with food systems. If you want to locate a supermarket or a farm, you usually have to follow some rules designed by a planner. We are also the natural conveners. If you ever attended any type of community meeting, it was probably facilitated by a planner. We are accustomed to be meeting with a series of stakeholders, and the way planning is set up, we are supposed to take a 360 point of view when making decisions and solving problems. So back into, we also provide technical assistance to organizations and community groups based on request. Back in 2007, the American Planning Association recognized that these tasks are very important for the food systems, so that planners do have a role in the strengthening of these regional food systems. So the organization in 2007 adopted its first policy guide on community and regional food planning. For those of you that are not tracking the numbers, that was about 13 years ago. So after hearing all of this, you probably think that, wow, planners are very woke. Working towards the public good is definitely ingrained in our profession. However, when it comes to food systems practice, there is still some work to be done. I would like to illustrate this point using a story. Several years ago, I worked as a county planner for Orange County, and this required me to take calls from the public to answer questions about zoning standards and development and general development. One day, I received a call from a lady in a semi-rural part of the county that wanted to start a strawberry farm. Based on her current zoning district, I said, hey, no problem. It is allowed, I said allowed use. However, she also wanted to have a cow so she could use the manure to fertilize the plants. And this is where I had to really go and break her heart and tell her that that was not an allowed use. We were able to work with her and ask for a down zoning, which ended up costing the farmer about $1,500, and it was never guaranteed that she was able to get what she wanted. But what I want to show you is an example of what we refer to as a regulatory barrier. These are parts of the zoning code that are written to protect the public, but actually end up hindering the community's access to fresh food. And there are several reasons for this disconnect between land use policies and regional food systems. Planners often work in communities that are rapidly urbanizing and have to implement zoning codes that call for the strict separation of land uses. Moreover, the centralization of food production has also had an effect on how planners regulate food uses. For example, several of the communities I've studied have very specific regulations prohibiting food processing uses. My region, for example, is home to one of the largest calf producing branches in the nation. But you won't find any large slaughterhouse operation within any of 8 counties. So it's very simple. You basically, a planner can't regulate what he doesn't know. More troubling to me, though, is that many state laws are currently preempting local governments from regulating any type of agricultural use. Planners can support the creation of a resilient food systems if we're preventing from doing our jobs by the state. Thankfully, there are several planning tools available for communities interested in developing a more resilient food system. This can be separated into long-range and current planning activities. The first long-range planning activity is a land use assessment. This is actually how I was introduced to food systems planning 10 years ago. Most jurisdictions have a comprehensive plan, which is a document that contains all the policies that govern the community's development. Most states require that comprehensive plans be updated periodically to help the community adapt to new circumstances. As part of this process, planners are tasked with using GIS mapping software to study the location, quantity, and distribution of land uses within their jurisdiction. The findings from this type of analysis will help guide the development of new land policies for the community. The map you see on the right is an example of this work. Here, we actually are looking at the distribution of agricultural land in the 8-county East Central Florida region. Next. Another example is known as asset mapping. This type of exercise highlights the physical and natural assets that contribute, to the community's development. Here, my team was able to identify the location of food production businesses within Central Florida. This type of map can help tell a story and help decision makers visualize the expanse of the region's food systems. And I would like to thank the Wallace Center for helping fund this research. Next. One planning tool that is often taken for granted is the urban route boundary. This is the imaginary line that separates the parts of the jurisdiction that will receive water and sewer services and the more rural parts of the community. Sadly, some jurisdictions see their route boundary as a line to be crossed. Other jurisdictions, like Seminole County, have actually adopted a rural boundary to protect their county's rural and agricultural areas from urban sprawl and development. Next. Other communities have become more creative in the preservation of rural land by adopting a transfer of development rights, or TDR ordinance. Here, the rural landowner is paid a fee to surrender the development rights of his or her property. This additional density is then transferred to a receiving site closer to an urban area. While the TDR concept is more often touted as a land conservation tool, it has helped to preserve thousands of acres of pasture land in the nation. Another concept that has gained popularity recently across the nation is the innovation district. This is a location where public and private stakeholders work to attract complementary business and activities to promote economic growth. Not surprisingly, this concept is now being used to support local food systems. In 2016, the state of Michigan adopted the Good Food Charter, a roadmap to increase residents' access to locally grown healthy foods. This legislation has spurred the development of at least 7 food innovation districts across the state. Municipalities also are using current planning tools to strengthen their access to fresh food. The most important one has been the incorporation of food uses into their zoning codes. Cities like Atlanta, Boston, and Minneapolis have adopted urban agriculture ordinances to allow farming uses within urban areas. Salt Lake City also adopted a food artisan definition to allow small food processors to locate within urban areas. My team is currently using some of these best practices to develop the food systems ordinance for the city of Orlando. And talking about the city of Orlando, its planning department has been at the forefront of adopting policies that strengthen the community's food system. For example, it was one of the first cities in Florida to adopt a backyard chicken ordinance. Another progressive but less known initiative was the change of the home landscape ordinance to allow for front yard vegetable gardens within city limits. One last concept I wanted to bring up is the agri-hub. This is a residential development that contains a farm or community garden as a central community amenity. The Urban Land Institute recently published a guide that discusses some best practices for planning this type of developments. The COVID-19 pandemic has put in perspective some of the inequities created by our current food systems. Planners can play an important role in helping to create a more resilient food systems. This could be done by helping communities use asset mapping to identify gaps and opportunities, preserve agricultural land using several of the previously discussed tools, and increase food access by eliminating regulatory barriers and incorporating more food uses into their zoning codes. Finally, I don't want you to forget that planners are also the par excellence community conveners. Not only are we willing to work with a diverse set of stakeholders, but we can also help to provide technical assistance that could help strengthen the food system. And back to you, moderator. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Luis. Next, we're gonna have Amanda Carls, who is our next speaker, talk about the COVID-19 index from the Healthy Food Policy Project.
Thanks, Leilani, and thanks, Luis. Yeah, I'm going to sort of change gears a little bit now and talk about some of the things that are happening sort of more reactively, whereas a lot of what Luis was just talking about was sort of more proactive. So this is kind of switching a bit. But first, I want to just again say I'm Amanda Carls. I'm a staff attorney at the Public Health Law Center, and I am just so overwhelmed by the response to today's webinar. It's exciting to see that we have now over 300 participants logged in, and I'm really also just heartened to see such a great list of attendees. We were able to kind of scroll through beforehand and see all the people that were signed up, and it's just such an exciting list of I think, you know, great thinkers coming together right now at this really important time to be thinking about community food access and health equity issues. And so I applaud all of you for giving this important issue the time and attention it deserves, especially right now. So as Leilani said, I'm going to talk a bit about the Municipal COVID-19 Food Access Policy Index, which is a specific tool that we have kind of quickly developed in response to what has been happening over the last few months around the COVID-19 pandemic. And it is meant to be a complement to some of the other tools that are currently on the larger Healthy Food Policy Project website. If that is a site you are not familiar with, I encourage you to check it out. As Leilani was indicating, it is quite a bit different from the database of policies that we have. So we have sort of a larger database of healthy food policies for communities at the municipal level. And then we've got this index. And so the difference being that this index is very specific to food access during the COVID-19 pandemic. Another main difference being the level of detail that it goes into sort of the analysis. So for this index, we have decided to keep things fairly high level, just so that we could pivot quickly and get as much information out to you all as quickly as possible into communities, so that we can sort of crowdsource and info share and get information to people as fast as possible. So what you'll find in this index is that you'll find the jurisdiction, you'll find sort of a general categorization of the policy types. You will find a link to the actual policy document itself, which I think is very helpful. It's interesting to see the kind of actual instrument that is being used, and then you'll see a summary. So again, just to kind of highlight what we're talking about with this index, we're talking about formal municipal policies that accelerate, prioritize, or facilitate food access during COVID-19. And we think it will also be useful, and at some point we might even change the name, but hopefully useful for other emergency type periods. Hopefully we won't see another pandemic anytime soon, but of course there are always other natural disasters, and as well as other events that could happen, such as recessions and things like that, that these types of policies might be useful for in other contexts. So these specific food access policies that we're highlighting, again, they're at the municipal level, and we're really looking for stuff that either exceeds ordinary non-emergency time policies, so things that allow food establishments and other actors to do things that maybe they wouldn't ordinarily be able to do during non-emergency periods, but in a way that helps them expedite or facilitate food access, and or policies that specifically prioritize health and or equity considerations. So next slide. So I'm going to be kind of diving in, talking about some of the policies that we've been seeing, the things that we have been cataloging and putting in this index, not just to give you a kind of a flavor of what's in the index per se, but to also just kind of give you an understanding of what is out there in the world. I can't promise that we've been entirely comprehensive, but we've been doing a dang good job at looking around the country and trying to fill in gaps geographically, so that we can get a broad sense of what is going on right now. Sometimes it's difficult to capture everything in real time just because of the ways that some municipalities put their information out to the world. But we, again, are trying to move quickly and to find a good variety, both geographically and in terms of policy type. So I think you'll get a sense of kind of what we're seeing right now. And then at the end of the discussion too, we can talk a little bit, or I'll talk a little bit about perhaps what might be next in terms of other areas of opportunity. But before we do that, I think it's helpful just to kind of understand what's not in the index. So things that we have not included include school district policies and other special board policies. Those things can be very important. We're seeing that right now, especially school districts have been instrumental in food distribution at this particular juncture. However, just because of the scope of the larger healthy food policy project where this index sits, that's something that we're not diving into here. But of course, we do not mean to diminish by any means the importance of those actors or those types of policies. We also are not really looking at policies that merely define food establishments, such as restaurants, grocery stores, and the like, as essential businesses, or otherwise just kind of let them operate or stay open amid other business closures, unless they are emphasizing priority population access, or access to fresh foods. And by priority populations, kind of going back to what Leilani is saying, I think it's helpful to kind of understand some of the terms of art that we're using. And in this context, when we're talking about priority populations, we mean groups with unique healthcare needs or issues, as well as groups that tend to be socially disadvantaged or marginalized. And one other thing that you won't find in this particular index, again, because we're focusing on those sort of, big P policy types, you won't find sort of programmatic and partnership efforts that are not created by a formal municipal level policy document, such as like an ordinance, a resolution, or an emergency order. Again, those types of programmatic strategies, public-private partnerships, et cetera, are certainly very valuable tools, and we are seeing them come in to great effect right now across the country However, again, given the scope of the project, where we're really looking at actual policy instruments, it's just outside of the scope of this particular project. However, I'm going to share with you a few slides down the road here, a link to some other resources, and one of them is the National League of Cities COVID-19 Local Action Tracker. And that would be, I think, a really helpful resource for anybody wanting to just sort of generally understand other types of activities that municipalities are engaging in right now that might be outside of those, you know, sort of more formalized policies. Next slide, please. So at a very broad level, types of policies that we've identified, and again, I think this is fairly reflective of what is currently out there right now across the country. I've kind of bucketed these into broad categories. This is not necessarily how we've categorized them on the site. I've tried to kind of raise it up a level and come up with some kind of broader buckets, but I'll talk about these each a little bit more in depth here. But generally, we're seeing laws that deal with food supply chain and procurement issues, things that deal with sort of food support, laws that prioritize fresh food, food cultivation, and activities like hunting and fishing. Laws that prioritize priority populations in their ability to procure food, and then special exemptions and allowances for food establishments during this time. Next slide. So kind of just digging in a little bit to what some of these buckets mean and to give you some kind of concrete examples. This first one here is sort of in the supply chain and procurement law bucket. Things you'll see there are things like laws that deal with government's ability to distribute, allocate, or ration food during emergency periods such as this, as well as to control the price of food. Interestingly, I'm seeing both sort of reactive policies, people coming up, or communities coming up with this right now as an emergency measure. And I'm seeing even at least one example that I can think of where this type of measure was already in place, but a community, so it was already on the books and ready to go, and a community just needed to activate it. So I think that's an interesting opportunity to, as we're sort of thinking about how we do this going forward, how we can do this better going forward. These things don't always need to be completely reactive. Sometimes there can be opportunities to think about what could be in place that so you could kind of just quickly flip a switch when you need to activate them. But a couple examples here that are just kind of exemplary or worth looking at, but there are many more in the index. One here from Champaign, Illinois, that's one of these kind of examples where the executive, here in this case the mayor, has the ability to control prices of food and to also do other things to sort of regulate distribution of food. And then this Atlantic County, New Jersey example, that's one where the county has decided whether they're gonna sort of take some of the what might otherwise feel like red tape around some of the contracting that happens with the county to allow for food procurement contracts to happen in a sort of more expedited manner without having to go through some of those normal processes. Next slide. Other things we're seeing here are food support laws, and I think that these are things like this are oftentimes seen more in programmatic strategies that oftentimes don't end up in our index because they don't have a formal municipal sort of policy document behind them. But here are a couple examples of two that do, both really interesting. I think the one from Seattle, Washington is one that I really want to call out. Again, this is an example where a community was thinking proactively. So, and probably never thought about this particular context, but because of some work that they've been doing for several years now, they were able to act quickly around the COVID-19 situation. So what happened there is Seattle has a sweetened beverage tax, and they were actually able to take several $1 million of funding from that tax fund and to allocate it to create a new $5 million grocery voucher program. So that's just an interesting way where we can think about how we can be proactively sort of creating rainy day funds for situations like these using other public health measures. Next slide. So other laws that we've identified, and we're trying to look for these again, because right now it's not just important that people have access to food, but that they have access to a healthy food, and that we don't lose that during this period. We're really looking to try to find laws that are emphasizing opportunities for people and communities to access fresh food, or to, in some cases, cultivate that food themselves. And so we are highlighting those laws when we see them. A lot of them look similar to this Anchorage, Alaska example. I love this. I pulled this one out, not because it's atypical. It's actually very typical of what we're seeing, but what is a little bit atypical about it, and I just like it, is the title. It's the order. They call it a hunker down order, which I thought was, I don't know, maybe just a little more cozy sounding than a stay-at-home order. So I pulled that one out just for fun. But what they're doing there is highlighting that that activities like fishing, hunting, farming, and other activities of this sort are critical, and they're things that should continue even while other businesses and activities are ordered to stop. And so they're not just allowed to stay open, but they're actually encouraged to do so, and encouraged to continue. And then there's another interesting one here that my colleague Ross Daniels is going to jump on in a bit, might talk about as well. But this one comes out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And here the community has really recognized the importance of urban agriculture and how that is going to help their community be really resilient and come back after the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, in a strong, positive way. And so what they're doing is directing city departments to kind of think through how they can be incentivizing and empowering residents to create urban agricultural sites in the city. And if you are interested in that particular policy, I would encourage you to check it out on our in our index. You can find it by sorting for Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And actually, I'll take a quick pause right now to point out, as I should have done it earlier, when you do go to that part of our website, the Healthy Food Policy Project.org, and you get into the COVID-19 Food Access Index, you will see you can not only look at the index and the policies kind of right from that page, but there's actually an opportunity to download the spreadsheet that kind of underlies it, so that you can play around with that spreadsheet and you can sort and filter however sort of makes sense to you. Sometimes it might be interesting to see what's happening, for example, in a particular state or city. Sometimes you might want to get a sense, though, instead of like what types of policies are out there. I think that's actually generally a more useful way to use it. So anyway, all of those sorting possibilities are out there. Next slide. So another example we're seeing are these sort of priority population food procurement protections. Largely, we are seeing this related to special shopping hours, dedicated shopping hours for elderly persons, disabled persons, other people with immunocompromised systems. So here's an example from Los Angeles, but this is sort of one of several here. The city is requiring certain shopping hours to be exclusively for particularly vulnerable populations. I've also seen ordinances or orders where this would extend to other food establishments such as food shelves and food banks as well. Next slide. And then this sort of last category, broad category that we're seeing are these special exemptions and allowances for food establishments. So in some cases, these are kind of more of these like exceptions to business closures, where certain establishments, whether that be nursing homes or homeless shelters, food shelves, school meal services, et cetera, are allowed to keep operating while other things are being told to cease operations. and in other cases, like this Moore Park, California example, it's more about sort of providing flexibilities that would not normally be allowed in non-emergency type periods. So here there's, in the Moore Park example, the city is saying they're gonna suspend their ordinances that would normally prohibit delivery of groceries during sort of like nighttime hours, so that they can alleviate some of the supply chain issues that I presume that particular community has been challenged with at some point during the pandemic, as have been many others. Next slide. So I think what's interesting is to have seen from, kind of the beginning of when we started doing this index just a couple of months ago to now how things are evolving, and to think about what might be next. I had an interesting conversation this morning with the office of the president of the Brooklyn Borough in New York. They are right now proposing legislation, as I understand it, and I'm ad-libbing here, so I'm hoping I get this right, but as I understand what they were describing to me, looking at finding ways that where there is sort of any kind of municipal level distribution of food, that there be an emphasis or even a requirement that that food meet certain nutritional standards. And I think that's one thing that we will likely start to see more communities doing, not just making sure that there's foods in tummies, which of course is important, but also making sure that the quality of food is the best that it can be, especially as we consider the health impacts that this pandemic is having for folks that have not had access to particularly healthy diets, and thinking about the ways that this whole pandemic has laid bare some of the major inequities in our systems. Another thing I can imagine seeing is laws that will come into place to start thinking about how we can provide things like safe and sick leave for food workers, so that there is an opportunity when people are feeling sick to stay home, so that we don't have to shut down, for example, a whole meat processing plant because a pandemic is spreading within that plant, and then therefore disrupting the food supply chain. If there's more sort of safe and sick leave, like we're seeing a lot of municipalities doing already, but especially if there's some intentionality around that and how that is working during the COVID-19 crisis, I think that could have some major impacts and an interesting area to explore. Another thing, and another piece I'm hearing is just the intersection of access to information and food access. And so I think we will start to see more people recognizing, more communities recognizing the need for community-wide internet access, and how that really is a health equity issue. Of course, it's also important for a variety of other reasons, including facilitating learning at schools and things like that during distance learning. But I will not be surprised to see more communities thinking about how that is impacting food access as well. And then also just communities starting to think about how they can maybe suspend or on a long-term basis change their zoning and licensing laws to make sure that things like mobile pantries and mobile markets can easily move about and stop and park throughout their communities without having restrictions on that, to make sure that we can not just have food available, but that food can be brought actually to people where they need it, especially given transportation issues right now, and given some concerns about using public transportation at this time. I think that's another area. Another kind of corollary to that would be thinking about how vehicles that have traditionally been used for things like mobile restaurants could instead be retrofitted and used for mobile delivery of hot meal service. And so how could communities make sure that their licensing zoning laws are set up in such a way that there aren't restrictions on moving through residential neighborhoods, for example, at least during this emergency period, to maybe be able to do some of that hot meal distribution. Also, just, long term, I think there's going to start to be kind of a larger look at how there can be more support for local and regional food production. Healthy Food Policy Project is always looking for policies that, have that sort of local economic focus. But I think now more than ever, even though we're not specifically focused on thinking about local food within the context of that project, I think we can all see right now why it's very beneficial to have food systems that are as regional and local as possible, just given supply chain distribution disruptions that we've been seeing. And then the other thing is sort of how do we do these safer reopenings? What are ways that we can, as we are reopening, do other things, maybe kind of along the lines of those priority shopping hours that I was talking about, but I'm sure that there are other ways that we haven't thought about next that we can start to make things more safe as we reopen things a little bit, so that we're continuing to protect especially vulnerable populations during this time. Next slide. So just quickly here, we will, as Leilani mentioned, be sharing this slide set with you. It'll be available after the presentation. So no need to try to quickly jot these links down now. I know they're super long, but just wanted to share with you a few other resources I've got here on the screen. One is that National League of Cities Local Action Tracker, which I think is really a helpful resource for kind of understanding generally what's going on around the country and municipalities. The Resnick Center and the UCLA Law or School of Law have put together another food law resource guide that's more comprehensive than just municipal law. It covers a range of state level, federal resources. And then Change Lab Solutions also has a similar set of links to other sites and resources. So they're also sort of serving as a clearinghouse for pulling together some of this information. Next slide. And then finally, I know that preemption, and it's something Louisa has already mentioned in today's presentation, but preemption is always an issue that's coming up at times like these when we're thinking about how we make sure we're enacting effective local level policy. It's a complicated issue. It is one that I will not have time to address today, but I know that many of you might have questions about it. So I want to just provide here another resource. You'll find it on the Public Health Law Center website. And again, no need to write this link down. You'll get the slide set if you want it, but also if you just go to the publichealthlawcenter.org website and in our search bar, type the word preemption, you should be able to find this pretty easily as well. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ross Daniels, who's going to kind of do some more of this kind of proactive thinking and help us kind of start, thinking about next steps and where we go from here. So thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Luis and Leilani. Hi, everyone. As Amanda said, I am Ross Daniels. I'm Amanda's colleague at the Public Health Law Center. So we've heard some great things from Luis about how planning with a consideration and an eye on food systems can really help make your community more resilient and more prepared in the face of a crisis like this. And we just heard from Amanda about how municipalities are responding through policy. I am both a planner and a policy analyst. I kind of work in the nexus of this space. And I wanted to just close by offering some brief thoughts about how some of the municipal food policies that Amanda talked about and the proactive nature of planning can kind of intertwine and plant the seeds for some really good ideas to help make communities more resilient through food systems planning and policy. And just how they map into just a changed society that will look very different on the other end of COVID-19. And the first thing I'm really thinking of is open space. So I saw a survey maybe a month ago by Gartner, which is a global research firm of American CFOs who oversee largely white-collar workforces. And about 3/4 of these people expect at least some of their employees who transition to work from home to not come back. Another consideration is brick and mortar retail. How much of that is going to go online permanently? And these are conversations that we can look at just in the form of just how we go about our day-to-day lives very differently. But these situations also contribute directly to a physical landscape with acres and acres of properties that are no longer being used. And that's why I think it's really cool to see a city like Pittsburgh that Amanda talked about, just assessing vacant land as an opportunity to improve the food system. It's an idea that really takes hold of the current situation that we're in, and looks into the future and thinks about how our future city with a robust urban agricultural infrastructure can really make ourselves more prepared and more resilient in the events of future shocks to the food system. Relatedly is our transportation networks. I know here in Minnesota, at least, our own Department of Transportation is monitoring how our roads are being used in a time where our assumptions regarding commuting patterns are going belly up and just don't really apply anymore. I noticed when I was reviewing this policy index that Amanda talked about, Madison, Wisconsin actually looked to its Transportation Commission to pass an ordinance that suspends parking regulations to better accommodate grocery delivery drivers. And in effect, the city is saying, right now, we have more important things to think about than street parking. And we have a lot of open space on our transportation networks that can be used for other things, in particular, getting food to people, which really to me provides insight into what our streets can be and how they can be a powerful force for human-centered things like food security. And finally, one thing I'm really hoping to see more of gets at this preservation of land, which Luis talked about at some length when he talked about agri-hoods and urban growth boundaries. This is something that has historically been threatened by suburbanization mainly. And the main reason this is a concern now is because even though the relationship between health outcomes among people who have had COVID-19 and population density is not at all decided yet, there is a very real concern about living in cities that is growing. I consider this to be kind of the golden age of the urban planning think piece, if you will, as kind of captured by that headline that the New York for the op-ed that the New York Times published. Well, you want to go straight back into the crowd. I don't think there was really a solid answer that was given. And so to that end, I think, you know, how do we respond to this concern about density through a food systems policy lens? And to that end, I think that it's important that so many of the policies that we've captured have actually been countywide efforts. Amanda talked about Johnson County, Kansas, for instance, because these local policies really ensure coordination between various municipalities within a single area, between urban centers and rural areas that are on the outer edge of the counties. And I think that this is the type of coordination that we'll want to see more of moving forward. So I know we have a very, very diverse audience, but I think for planners in the audience, a lot of local policies we're seeing have very good, very proactive ideas that get to the heart of resiliency work and preparedness work that Luis talked about. And I'm very interested to hear either through the chat or you can reach out to us directly if your community is starting to think about these high-level, systems-level responses to this emergency for now. And with that, I will give it back over to Lonnie.
Great. Thanks, Ross. So much to think about. So we've got about 7 minutes left, and we've got some really great questions that have come through. Just a reminder, if you have any questions or other resources that are relevant, use the Zoom chat feature to share those or the Q&A. All right, so I'm going to start off with one for Amanda. This should not be too difficult of a question. Somebody's wondering, do many of the policies that you were talking about from the COVID-19 index have a termination date, or are they in effect until the state of emergency ends? When do they end?
Yeah, for the most part, what I'm seeing is that there is language around, this is in effect during the state of emergency period beginning on X date without like an end date. And so presumably, or not presumably, the way that they would work is that when the state of emergency that underlies them is declared to have ended, then they would no longer be in effect as well.
Right. All right. We have a question about the U.S. pork market. As a lot of people know, it's facing a bottleneck in the supply chain and the way the meat is flowing from the farm to packing house, distribution centers, markets to consumers. There's a lot going on there when processing plants close. It's been a big challenge for farmers and processors to deal with, like, the amount of processing that needs to get done when you don't have those processing plants open. The question is about how local communities can help flatten the chain to connect farmer to consumer. What land use and economic development policies can local governments pursue to help, like, kind of shorten that or flatten it, as the question said. So I was thinking, Luis, do you mind taking a stab at that, and then Amanda and Ross can chime in afterwards? You still there, Luis?
Sorry, I was muted.
Okay.
No, thank you. Thank you for the question. So what local municipalities need to understand and really need to take a deep view is what is their, like, food systems infrastructure already set up in their communities. So when we talk about flattening a curve, like, for example, are you allowing, if you're in an urban area, are you allowing any type of urban agriculture or small farming within your community? Because most probably what you're gonna have, the one that's actually gonna come, is gonna be that small farmer. There are several policies you can follow. You can have farmers markets. Here in our region, the Seminole County Health Department actually helps sponsor a farmers market in a food desert community called Goldsboro. That really helped to bring access to fresh food to an underserved community. And again, what they had to do, which is what requires some type of government intervention, they actually had to subsidize those vendors that come in. So you will have to provide some type of funds so they can have those vendors come in, because they cannot, especially in these small communities, they might not be able to make an income all the time. Anything that, if you're a small farmer, you have a farmer's market, something that I think that could go, if you have like a farm stand ordinance, farm stands are usually considered more like an accessory use. But if you're allowed in some of your community, and then sort of just like a peddler type of license, and I'm able to set in, go to a site, they already have all the facilities, like the bathroom where that the vendor can use. You are actually allowing people to have those close contact to consumers. I will even go further than that. There's other infrastructure that's currently lacking. Right now, we don't have enough shared community kitchens. This is the startup space for most food entrepreneurs, whether they're farmers, because it also gives an opportunity for them to process some of that extra food. I also think that the state of Florida recently adopted the cottage food law. That is happening all over the United States. It's basically a law that allows you to do some sort of processing activity in a home-based business. Like if you want to bake a cake, you can bake a cake in your regular kitchen. That reduces costs. That's very important, and it connects the people together with the consumer. Local food purchasing ordinances. I know that's something that in Florida we haven't really tried that much, especially because there's not currently a big farmer community that can serve high needs of institutions. But that usually also helps, because what you need to start developing is your ecosystem or infrastructure of like food systems infrastructure. And I don't know if Ross and Amanda had any other comments.
I'll just quickly say two things. One, I think local public health inspectors that are in the position of granting licenses to what's, at least in these parts, I'm in Minnesota, called custom exempt processors, can do things to facilitate that licensing by, for example, doing Zoom inspections to try to get inspections done quickly and perhaps more safely. Also just to prioritize applications for those types of licenses. So those custom exempt processing basically allows smaller facilities that are basically like kind of more like a butcher shop or somebody that could break down a deer, for example, to be able to process, cattle and pork. And right now they're, at least in this, again, part of the country, seeing that there's a backup, so that there's a lot of animals, and a lot of animals that are getting euthanized because we just don't have the capacity to process all of them. So if we open up some of those other, smaller facilities to allow them to do some processing, that could help. Also, just to the extent that zoning might be in the way of that, if there is, for example, a butcher shop that might want to expand to do some of this custom exempt processing, a city could make sure that they were looking through its code, and at least on a temporary basis, if not on a long-term basis, make sure that their zoning chart would allow for custom exempt processing in parts of the city where at least butcher shops were also allowed to exist.
Great. All right, I see that we have hit our 3 o'clock, at least Eastern time here. So I think we're gonna have to wrap it up. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of the questions. There were a lot of really good ones, but thank you all for joining. We're going to send a follow-up that has links and the PowerPoint, and we'll try to answer some of these questions that were sent in so you can see what others are asking. But with that, thank you to the speakers. Thank you to all the attendees. Thanks to Stephanie for pulling it off with the logistics, and stay tuned for an email from us and future webinars. Thanks, everybody.